Hi, this is the Magnificent Midlife Podcast, and I'm Rachel Lancaster. This is where we celebrate women in midlife and beyond. We challenge the status quo and bash those negative stereotypes about being an older woman. We're not over the hill at 40, 50, 60. We're just getting started, and the world needs us now more than ever. I'll be talking all things midlife, about issues that matter, and sharing fabulous stories of amazing women doing very cool stuff. Now is our time. My guest today is Julia Brewer Daily, and she is a novelist who wrote her first book, No Names to Be Given, when she was over 50. This book was inspired by her own experience as an adopted child from a maternity home hospital in New Orleans. She's also the host of the Authors Over 50 podcast. Her mission is to encourage those in midlife and beyond to live their best lives in what she calls life's sweetest third. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be with you.
It's really great that you're here, and I'm very excited to delve into your life now and how it has changed and the books that you're now writing, because I know you've written 2 and you've got 2 out there. I don't know whether you've got any more. You can tell us about that in a moment. But first of all, I'd like to ask you, I know your first book is a very personal story. Can you tell us about that?
As you mentioned, I am an adopted child, and I was adopted at 2 months of age from a maternity home. And my birth mother was Catholic and my birth father was Jewish. And back in the 1950s, that was unheard of that they marry. So she relinquished me for adoption, and I was adopted by a lovely couple who could not have children of their own. And I went to live in Mississippi. And many years later, I searched and found my birth mother, and through DNA results, my birth father's side of the family. And so that gave me some insight into adoption and what it really means. I had never really considered it, of course, as a child. I was told I was a chosen child, and I believed that and thought that I was a very fortunate person to have such a lovely family. And then I got to know the situation around adoption, and that being adopted can be both wonderful and sad at the same time, because for an adopted child to receive a family, that birth mother must relinquish that child. So adoption is really a two-sided coin. There's excitement and joy for the adoptive parents and sadness and grief for the birth mother. So that was stored away in my psyche for a long time. And when I moved to Texas, I found some manila folders, some files where I had actually written a couple of chapters about this story because I wanted to fictionize it. It has a thread of memoir running through it. It's a very personal story to me, and many of the chapters about the adopted child in that book are pretty much verbatim from my own life. And I wanted to write this book as fiction instead of memoir because my birth mother was still alive at the time. And, there were family secrets back then. Young women who were unwed and pregnant were sent away to these maternity homes to have their babies. And they were supposed to return home as if nothing happened and to pick up their lives before they had this baby. So she still had secrets in her family. She had 2 other children, and she had not told them that she had relinquished a baby for adoption. So I wanted to fictionalize the story, but still tell some of my story as well. And that's how I began to write this novel.
It's an incredible story. It really is. For somebody like me who just doesn't have any experience of that, I just think it's fascinating. As you say, it's sad, but it's happy. But it's just what strikes me when I hear you talk like that, and when I explored the book, how far we've come since then, because, the world is so different now, and yet it's not that long since that was the situation. And even, I mean, I don't know, how old were you when you did the DNA test and when you found your birth parents?
I searched and found my birth mother when I was pregnant with my second child. And the reason I was so interested in finding her was they didn't leave any health records with adopted children. So I didn't know if there was cancer in my family or diabetes or heart disease. And every time I would go into a doctor's office, they would ask me these questions. And I would have to say, I don't know, I'm adopted. And so we would have to start from scratch. And my first child had a lot of allergies. And I just kept thinking, maybe some of this is hereditary. Maybe I should know what is in my DNA, what's in my background. But of course, back then there were no DNA commercial kits, that people gift now. And so I had to go back to the beginning. And of course, the records are all sealed. There are very few states in the United States that have open records where you as an adult can go and find out about your birth family. So luckily for me, I was born in New Orleans, and there was a Napoleonic law still on the books that said that an adopted child could inherit from their natural parents. Well, you can't inherit from somebody you don't know. So that was the loophole that opened the gate for me to be able to get my original birth certificate. And when I achieved that, because I don't know if you know, since you don't know a lot about adoption, but when you are adopted, they change your birth certificate. They reissue a birth certificate as if the adoptive family gave birth to you. And they
Really?
seal away the original birth certificate. So when I opened that file and saw the original birth certificate, I found out, the hour I was born and how much I weighed. And there was an address on it with my birth mother's name. And I searched and found that address on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. And my birth grandmother was still living there. And so I contacted her and I asked her, did you have a daughter? Do you have a daughter who gave up a baby for adoption? And she said, absolutely not. And see, they were still protecting and still keeping those family secrets. And I said, well, here's my contact information if she would like to reach out to me. And I left that with her. And that night, my birth mother called me.
Wow. And when was that? What year was that?
That was 1976.
So that was still quite a
A
while
long
ago.
time ago.
Yeah.
Yes, a long time ago. And you talked about how far we've come maybe as a society, because there are a lot of young women who keep their babies when they become pregnant. They don't necessarily want to marry and they can be single parents. But back then, that was not the case. Back then, it was called the baby scoop era. And probably from the 1930s all the way to probably the 1980s, young women were forced to give up these babies. Society did not look approvingly on this, and they were shaming their family and their community, and all this shame and guilt was heaped on their heads. And when I go to speak to book clubs, and these young women are in these book clubs, and they're just incredulous. They just
Mm.
say, why would anyone give up a baby, their firstborn baby? What caused them to do this? Because they don't understand the times that we lived in back then.
It's so difficult to imagine, isn't it? I mean, even, I can imagine it because I remember what it was like when I was growing up and the stigma around divorce. And certainly, there were I knew nobody who had children, we would say, out of wedlock. I
Exactly.
knew nobody at all. And yet now it's almost certainly where I'm in London. I mean, there's probably at least 50% of children are born out of wedlock. You know, they're not from a married. They might have a family, but that marriage isn't part of that. So it's a radical change, isn't it, that we've gone through in quite a short period of time, relatively speaking.
It really is. And can you imagine receiving a birth certificate that's stamped illegitimate on
Oh,
it
I know,
without a
I know.
father's name listed? I mean, just imagine that. And I think that we have come a long way, from the shame and guilt that was heaped on these unwed mothers when they were shipped away. And today, a lot of babies are kept and single mothers are treated differently, but there still are maternity homes, and women still have the choice. Well, they have the choice now to relinquish their babies or to keep those babies. And some of these maternity homes are trying to help them. They try to help them with jobs or daycare so that they have a better opportunity to keep those babies.
So you said that you were told you were chosen. Did you understand by chosen that your parents weren't your biological parents? When did you know that you were adopted? How did that work?
I don't ever remember a time when I didn't know that I was adopted. My adoptive mother told me that she started reading little books to me when I was, 2 years old, and talking about, you didn't grow in my tummy, but you grew in my heart. Those kind of messages. So I really did feel that I was a gift. At that time, I thought, this is a wonderful thing. And my father would tell me stories, and one of those is in my book, that they walked into that maternity home and there was a room full of babies, and he walked over to the bassinet, and I held up my arms and said, "Here I am, Daddy." And he picked me up and knew that I was his. Well, that was a real fantasy because I was 2 months old. I wasn't talking. I didn't hold my hands up to him. There wasn't a room full of babies like in a hospital nursery, but they always made me feel, very special. And they were told that they would never be able to have children. And back then, another strange occurrence is that parents who wanted to adopt had to have a certificate from their doctor that they were unable to give birth to a baby, and they had to have their church sign off on it. And there were so many regulations and rules, and you had to have a home visit, that this baby was going to have its own room. There were just a lot of stipulations, a lot of paperwork, a lot of hoops that they had to jump through to adopt a baby. And it was kind of the old adoption syndrome, because after they adopted me, 19 months later, they had a little boy. My brother was born, and 10 years later, my sister. So she
Really?
was
That's
she was
classic, isn't
able to
it?
have children.
That's classic. You hear that so much. And
Yes, we call it the adoption syndrome.
yeah, and I have this theory that it's about the pressure being taken off. Once the pressure is taken off with the stress of trying for a baby and going through all that process, then it just happens, doesn't it? It's amazing how that happens. Wow.
Yes, and there are 100 million Americans who have adoption in their immediate family. And so everybody that I talk to and everybody who's read the book, who's reached out to me, that's been my favorite part of writing this novel. Is I've heard from other adoptees, I've heard from adoptive parents, I've heard from birth parents. One birth mother from California wrote me and said that she relinquished her son in the same maternity home where I was born in New Orleans. So there are just so many wonderful connections and so many stories to be told.
So you talked about, so when you found your birth mother and when you wrote the book and published the book, your birth mother was still not, she didn't acknowledge you publicly. Did she ever?
She did. She finally told her sons that she had relinquished me for adoption, that they had an older sister, and I actually was able to meet them. And another fun fact about her is that she was so distraught over having to relinquish me for adoption. She stayed in the maternity home far longer than any of the other girls, I was told. And she would rock me every day and feed me. And she was being counseled by a Jesuit priest. And he fell in love with her and gave up the priesthood to marry her.
Oh my land!
Yes.
Oh my, really?
That's another whole book in itself, isn't it?
It is. Oh my goodness!
Yes. So they traveled all over the world.
So your birth mother was quite the. I don't know. She was a man magnet, wasn't she?
I guess she was. I didn't get that gene, but
I'm sure you did.
But they were a very interesting couple. Of course, I got to know them much later in life, but they lived all over the world and taught English to foreign countries. Her boys were born in Saudi Arabia, and so they were quite interesting.
Wow. And what about your birth father?
Well, he died 30 years ago, so I never got to meet him. But this is interesting as well. These crazy DNA kits that we all take as kind of a joke, to find out where we came from. Well, they're very accurate because I received a message from one of these companies that I had a match and a message that said, "Are you my sister?" And that will get your attention. So my birth father's, one of his daughters reached out to me because she had taken the same test and found out that, yes, we are half sisters. And then a first cousin reached out and he said, "I know all my first cousins. Who are you?" And I said, "Well, I don't show up on your family tree." But he and I have become great pen pals. He lives in California, across the country from me. And he is also a writer. He's written several books. And I went out to California to celebrate his 90th birthday with him. And it was quite special because I got to see the Jewish side of the family and to understand what it would have been like if I had grown up in that family. So it was quite a gift to me to get to know him and to hear his recollections about my birth father. And they grew up in Chicago together.
Wow, there is so much in your background, isn't there? There's so much. Gosh, it feels like just fascinating. I mean, I know you had to go through a lot to get that, but you've found a lot, haven't you, by the process that you've gone through?
Yes, and as an adopted child, you always have these fantasies of where you came from and what was the problem, why would they give you up for adoption? Was there anything wrong with you? There was a lot of trauma probably around my first memories and my first being relinquished and all of that. A lot of adoptees talk about that primal wound and being given up, given away from your birth mother. But I had a great childhood and a great imagination. And I would think, well, I'm an Indian princess who was stolen from her tribe, or another recollection that I had was I looked so much like my adoptive father. Maybe I'm truly his child, and my poor adoptive mother is having to put up with rearing his mistress's child. You would just go through all these scenarios in your mind.
Oh.
And so that was, I think, something that fueled this desire to write about it in some way.
And why did it take you so long to write it? Why did you wait so long?
I was a single parent. Not an unwed mother, but I came through divorce, and I had 3 young children, and so I worked lots of different jobs, and I had lots of careers, and I've reinvented myself so many times over the years. And every time I would find a job listing, I would think, I can do that. And so I think I just put it aside. I just thought one day I'll write that book. And until I retired and moved and found those chapters that I had actually written while I was working at a university, they allowed us to take classes as part of our compensation. So I took some writing classes and I wrote some of these chapters and put them in a manila envelope and tucked them away. And I found those when we moved to Texas. And I said, well, if not now, when? I need to write this book. So I did.
Brilliant. And you decided to make it a novel rather than a memoir. Although, obviously, as you've said, there was lots of memoir in the book. But I'm wondering, because you put yourself in the place of 3 mothers on this maternity ward, don't you? Did that help you understand what had gone on by going through that process, by actually trying to, step into their shoes?
Definitely, I developed even more compassion and empathy for birth mothers until I really put myself in their place and tried to imagine what it would be like, especially those of us who've had a child. I mean, you think about your own child and think, is there any situation that would cause me to gift this child to strangers? And you have to really put yourself in their position and understand the times in society back then. And so I wanted to show that these women came from different walks of life. They weren't just impoverished women, they were from very upper class backgrounds. They were from poverty. They were from all different situations. And they were all in the same boat if they were unwed and pregnant. So I did make those 3 women very different and from different backgrounds. But when they met, they became fast friends, because it's kind of like being in a foxhole during war with somebody. You become very close in a short amount of time, and they lived together for months. And when I met my birth mother, I asked her about the maternity home. And the funny thing is, I had visited that maternity home many times because my parents would take me during the summer months. We would go to New Orleans, and that was one of our tourist attractions. We would stop by the maternity home and we could walk inside and see the bulletin boards with all the children's photos that were sent back, from these excited and happy adoptive parents. And I could see the backs of women still seated in a different room, as they sat around and talked or played cards. And so I had in my mind what the maternity home looked like. And it was right down the street from a great restaurant. And my father would always take us there afterwards to eat. So I had good memories of this maternity home. And I asked her, did I get it right? Did I describe the maternity home and what you went through as a birth mother? And she said, you did. In most cases, you got it exactly right. But she said, you were kinder. The staff was kinder in your novel than we were actually treated, because they were pretty much treated like you got yourself into this, and, you need to hurry up and give birth to this baby and go on back home. So she said, they were not treated as well as I described in the novel, but they did have to do chores. They did have to work in the garden. They did have to clean the toilets and keep their rooms and, all of that. So that's what I placed in the novel.
That was a real gift you gave your birth mother, that, you wrote her story and she was able to read your version of her story.
Well, I dedicated the book to my 2 mothers. One gave me life and one gave me a life.
I saw that. It's beautiful. So beautiful.
So that's the way I felt. I was never angry at her or never upset at her. I tried to understand her situation and luckily for me, not everyone has such a fortunate situation in their lives, whether adopted or not, but I had a lovely childhood.
So you've made it your mission to inspire other older women to also write. So do you find that other women like you, are they writing their own story generally, or are they coming up with something completely different, or are they writing non-fiction, or what are older women writing about in your experience?
I think so many of us are writing memoir. So many of us are looking back and remembering times from our childhood, whether they were traumatic or not. A lot of people are using writing as a way to work through their feelings, and it's kind of therapeutic to get your words down on paper and to try to make sense of what's happened in our lives. And a lot of people have been keeping journals for years, and some of them are taking those journals and turning those into a novel or turning those into memoir or just passing them along to their family members. That's what I try to encourage everybody to do, is that, leave a legacy for your family. Our children never imagine their parents as being humans, as being young once. And so they need to hear about our stories, because they're going to be lost if we don't put them down on paper and pass them along. So whether someone wants to actually publish and get that work out into the world, or whether they just want to hand their children a journal that says, here are my thoughts about this situation. Here's what happened, when your grandfather was in World War II. Here are the facts about, your family tree, and here are your health records. I mean, just any of that is such a legacy to leave to our children and our grandchildren. One of the authors that I interviewed just recently wrote some wonderful thoughts and comments to his grandchildren. And I just thought that was such a great way to be able to pass something along to them, all of his, thoughts and ideas about life and what makes life better and what might help them along the way. I just think that's a wonderful thing to do. And with all the options that we have today, especially the self-publishing route, so many people can publish for their family, whether they want to get it out on Amazon or not.
It's incredible, that, isn't it? I self-published my book, and it was hard, but it was also wonderful. And I decided to self-publish because I wanted to get it out now. I didn't want to have to wait. I didn't want to have to go through the process of applying for a start off and then having to wait, because I think even from the time of getting a book deal, it's 2 years at least, isn't it, before it actually hits the shelves. And I was determined it would be out sooner than that.
And that's what a lot of people my age are deciding. We want control over everything. First of all,
Yeah,
we
we
want to
do.
keep our funds, and we want to be able to say, this is my cover, not, can this be my cover, and have them say, no, we don't like that. So a lot of people are taking control, and self-publishing, is becoming very, very popular. And a lot of the books, you can't tell the difference between self-published books and those from one of the big 5 publishers. So it's become a real viable way for people to be able to get their words out into the world.
And now you've got the whole print on demand, which I think is just incredible. So you can just, somebody can order your book on Amazon, and Amazon will just print it there and then and send it to them, which is amazing, isn't it? It makes it all so much easier. There's no more having to buy 500 copies of your book and store them in your basement or in your back room if you don't have a basement.
So true. It is really an amazing industry.
Mm. So if a woman doesn't, has a feeling that they want to write something, doesn't really have an idea of what, and doesn't have any journals, what advice would you give them?
This is such a generous community. The writing community is so generous. If you know anyone who's written, you can reach out to them and they will share with you. This is my journey. This is my journey to publication. This is what worked for me and didn't work for me. And there's so many online classes now. Here in Texas, we have the Writers League of Texas, and you can tap into that from anywhere in the world. And they have online classes, they have writing retreats and conferences, and just about every state, every country has so many valuable resources for writers that there's really no excuse that you can't learn the craft.
Yeah.
You can learn the craft of writing, and you can start getting your message down on paper. And I just think that is so vital.
And what's your writing process?
I have to have the perfect conditions to write, just like I have to have the perfect conditions to sleep. Everyone laughs at me if I go to a conference and room with some, person, a strange person. They'll say, Julia, I could not believe how you had to put yourself to sleep. I have to have my earplugs. I have to have my mouth guard. I have to have the temperature at 68 degrees. It has to be completely dark. It can't have any night lights or anything like that in there. So I go through this entire routine trying to get myself to sleep. Otherwise, I'm like a vampire roaming around the house in the night and I can't go to sleep. Well, the same way when I write, I have to have the correct temperature. I have to have, my iced tea beside my desk. I have to have it totally quiet. I can't put on any music. Some people write with music in the background. They have to light a candle. We have all of these routines that we have to do to write. But what I do is wake up in the morning, feed my dogs, take them out. I run them around the property. They're big labs, so they have to have a lot of exercise. And then I come back in after that and I sit and I write for a couple of hours. And then after that, I go back and do what I need to as far as the house and the dogs are concerned. But that's the best time that I have found. I used to be a real night owl and stay up all night. But the older I get, I think I need to write while I'm fresh in the morning.
I completely get that about the sleep, Julia. I am in your camp. I have a mouth guard. I have the earplugs. I have a nightshade because I can't cope with any light. And if, you've got a Wi-Fi connector thing with a little light on it, nope. So I have a nightshade. And I completely get that. Yes. But it's transformation. When you get that right, then you sleep really well. And it's precious and it's important.
And so many of us are discovering that we have sleep apnea. And that's a whole nother ball game, with being hooked up to the CPAP machines and sleeping at night with those. My husband has one, and I think I'm going to have to get one. And I said, we'll have the dueling CPAP machines going. This is going to be so interesting.
Oh, gosh. Oh, dear.
Just trying to get a good night's sleep.
Yeah. I think, I don't consistently write. And I think it's probably because I'm not doing what you are suggesting in terms of I'm not applying the same logic to sleep as I would to writing. And I think if I did, I could write my next book. I'm a great procrastinator. I take 20 times as long as I need to write anything, which is really silly and annoying. I'm getting a bit better as I get older. But I think if I just cleared the decks, sat down 2 hours in the morning, get it done, I think that would be much more efficient.
You have to really treat it like it's a job and that
Yes.
your own deadline. I'm a great person on deadline. I can just get everything done.
Me too.
And one thing that I've learned that helped me write more quickly, I don't know if you've heard of NaNoWriMo, but it's National Novel Writing Month. And I did that a couple of Novembers ago. You have to take the challenge to write 50,000 words in the month of November. Well, that's like 1,782 words a day. It's a lot of words. And I had begun the first novel by writing a chapter, editing the chapter, going back and thinking about the chapter, putting
That's
it
not
down
the
and
way
coming
to
back
write,
to the
is it?
chapter.
I know that.
No. But I was an English major and I wanted it to be perfect before I passed it along, and went to the next chapter. But with NaNoWriMo, you have to write so furiously and get words on paper. You don't worry about punctuation. You don't worry about run-on sentences or anything. You just write and get those words out. And then at the end of the month, you actually have something to edit. So it's a great thing to do. If you set a word count or set a number of hours that you're going to write every day, it really does commit you.
Yeah, I've been tempted by that on several occasions, but it never seems to quite work out. And it won't work out this year either because I've got other plans. But maybe not next year either because I'll be finishing my master's at the year. I can do a different month.
You can choose a different month.
I could, couldn't I?
You don't have to wait till November.
I could, yeah, but it's fun to do it when everybody else is doing it, I think, because then you've got the community, haven't you?
But, I've always had this feeling inside my chest that I'm running out of time. I always feel like there's this wound up clock and it's just running rapidly. And it was so funny when I met my birth mother. I told her about that analogy and she stared at me and kind of gasped. And she said, "Your grandmother told me the exact same thing, that she feels that she's running out of time and she's not going to have enough time to do everything that she wants to do." And I've always felt that way. From an early age, I've thought, I've got to have all these different careers. I've got to travel to these exotic countries. I've got to, be courageous enough to admit all my relationship mistakes and walk away, even if I have a broken heart. I ran a marathon at age 60. And then wrote my debut novel after that. So I'm trying to pack in as much as I can into what I call life's sweetest third, because I'm running out of time and I've got to get it all accomplished.
Well, it's a bit stressful, but it's not a bad way to live. That's what I talk about in terms of midlife. We get to 50 up, we can't pretend that we've got longer left than we've already had. The clock is ticking down, which doesn't mean we're running out of time, but it means that if we want to do stuff, we've got to get our skates on, haven't we, really? We've got to cut through the procrastination and just get on with it.
Yes, because with age does come limitations for our bodies. I have 7 grandchildren, and I have promised each of them a senior trip when they graduate from high school. And I just returned from Spain for 2 weeks with 2 granddaughters who graduated this year from high school. And when I returned home, my husband said, "How many years are you going to be able to do this?" And I said, "I don't know. I was pretty tired on that trip." So I think we have to recognize, what we can and can't do, and just have the joy in doing for as long as we can.
But it's not a bad way to live, I think. I think having that idea that, life is precious and that we need to fill it with as much as we want, really. Not as much as we need, but as much as we want. It's that decision, isn't it? That's that. Because we may decide to fill it with absolutely nothing. But at least we're being true to what we want. Yeah. So tell me about your second book. It's interesting because you did the memoir bit with the first one, and then you created something completely original for the second, didn't you? But you took your inspiration from Texas. So tell us about the second book.
When we moved to Texas, I became enamored with these massive family ranches. They've been in the same family for generations, and some of them are larger than you can even imagine. I traveled to what was and may still be the largest ranch in Texas and maybe the United States. It has 1 million acres Can you imagine what
No.
1,000,000 acres of land looks like? It's
Oh my
larger than
goodness.
LA and New York combined.
Wow.
That's the property that these families have owned since, the 1800s,
Wow.
1700s. And so I started seeing a lot of them being chopped up into subdivisions and so many people moving into these properties. And it began to bother me. And we traveled to Colorado and went to Mesa Verde National Park, which is a beautiful park in Colorado that has these incredible ruins from an ancient people. You walk over this hill and you look, and this entire mountain looks like it's covered in condos. They were so well built. And I asked the guide, I said, where did these people go? Where did they leave? When did they leave? And he said, we don't know. We don't know if it was war or famine or drought, what caused them to leave. And it just triggered something in my mind. And I thought, well, if they left Colorado, they could have come to Texas. And if you owned 1,000,000 acres of land, they could be living on your property and you wouldn't know it. So the fifth daughter of Thorn Ranch kind of turns the stereotype of cowboys on its head, because women have owned this ranch for 5 generations. And the heiress to this largest ranch in Texas stumbles upon an ancient people living on her property. And that became my second book.
Wow. Fantastic. And that was out, I think, was it November last year that came out?
Yes, it just came out. Mm-hmm.
Very exciting. Well, best of luck with that. And have you started on another one? Of course you have. You must have done, right? Are you doing another one?
I have. It's going to be a psychological thriller. Sometimes we want to kill off some ex-husbands, and I just thought maybe I'll do that in a novel. I won't end up in prison, at least for that. But I'm very busy with the podcast, Authors Over 50. I've just been so honored by how many people want to speak about their journey after the age of 50, writing their first book. And that's what we celebrate on that podcast. I've interviewed 164 authors in just 1 year. So there are a lot of us. And then I have a media agent in Los Angeles who is shopping these 2 books, No Names to Be Given and Fifth Daughter of Thorn Ranch, to studios. And she thinks there's a great likelihood that they'll be picked up for a streaming service.
That's very exciting. I could definitely imagine. They both sound like the sort of books that would make great TV series. Yeah. Oh, well, that's fantastic. And so you're swapping genre again.
I am. I'm just jumping around like I did my careers. When something interests me, I follow that path, and I don't feel like I have to sit at the same desk for 30 years and then retire. And it's the same way with this writing. I'll just say, oh, that's a great thought. I might do that. So
I love that, because I think it's so easy for us to say, well, I need to write about this because this is what I know. But you can write about whatever you like, can't you? You can just, give it a go. Why not?
They say you write about what you know or what you would like to know. So I write about what I would like to know. And that's my advice for everybody, is that if they think they have a novel inside them, then it needs to find an audience. And it's never too late, because I think mature authors have the gift of a lifetime of experiences from which to draw. And that makes our work richer and sweeter. And it has the wisdom of hindsight.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Magnificent Midlife Podcast. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, follow, and share it. Also, giving a 5-star review really helps get the word out. You'll find the show notes at magnificentmidlife.com. That's also where you can get my book, Magnificent Midlife: Transform Your Middle Years, Menopause, and Beyond. Make the very best of your next chapter. Help me change the world, one magnificent midlife woman at a time.